Welcome to this video from the Consultants Development Institute. I'm Carter McNamara, an instructor with the Institute and the presenter in this video. Whether you are an internal or external consultant, now that you and your client have decided to proceed with the project, you both are ready for this phase, discovery and feedback. In this video, we'll review the primary goals and activities that occur in this phase. One of the goals is to find the root cause of the problem, first by targeting the problem to its primary location in the client's organization. To put the problem in context and to measure whether the problem has been solved later on, it helps to have some standard of performance for how an organization or part of an organization should perform. Problems are best solved by fully understanding their context, which takes some research that is carefully focused on the problem. During your research, you'll gather and organize relevant data about the problem and generate recommendations from that data. You'll share your recommendations in a highly focused feedback meeting with the overall goal of getting your client's agreement on how to proceed. One of the goals of this phase is to build a collaborative relationship between yourself, your client, and your project team. You've already described to your client in the contracting phase how you prefer to work collaboratively, and you explained the benefits of working that way. The fact that your client contracted with you suggests that he's open to working that way as well. And this phase is where you both begin practicing that kind of collaborative relationship. People who experience problems in organizations usually notice the symptoms of the problem first. So to get to the root cause of the problem, you, your client, and the project team will have to carefully research it. And that's another one of the goals of this phase. When you have found the root cause, you'll need to do more research in order to find the best solution to the problem. The solution is best conveyed as 5 to 7 overall recommendations or goals. Your client will have to agree on the goals, and you should be sure that other key players in the organization agree on them too. The goals for this discovery phase set the stage for the actions in the next phase, action planning. However, the most important goal for this phase is to energize and mobilize the client to solve the problem, because now there's hope and focus to do something about it. It's very useful at this point, early in the project, to form a project team. That ensures more effective problem solving by bringing more perspectives, time, and energy to the project. It also ensures that changes come from inside the organization rather than being directed by an outside consultant. Members of the team share their knowledge of the organization as they customize project plans and reports that will be understandable to others. These plans and reports should come from the team rather than from the consultant. The team monitors progress of the project, including implementation of plans, especially during the upcoming phases of action planning and implementation. They'll also help to sustain motivation and momentum during those phases. And they'll also be available to answer questions about the project. That helps members of the organization to see that project plans were developed not just by the consultant, but also by other members of the organization. The members of the team should include the consultant and someone who owns the problem, that is, someone very vested in seeing it solved. It should include someone with the authority to make major decisions about the project. It also should include someone who is highly enthusiastic and is a champion for the project. It needs an administrator who will schedule meetings and draft reports for the team. Of course, the consultant should be a member of the team as well. It's important that team members be taught the basics of successful organizational change. If you completed CDI's courses in the series, Foundations of Organizational Consulting, then you heard some basics of guiding successful organizational change. It will be useful now to remember the knowledge that you got from the CDI course, Building Trust, Commitment, and Collaboration with Clients, because you'll want that good collaboration now with this team. Before we look at more guidelines, let's talk about some different approaches to the discovery phase. They are similar to the overall approaches to problem solving that we talked about in CDI's course, Goals, Roles, and Reasons in Consulting. The scientific approach is based on the belief that the more accurate, valid, and reliable the research effort, the more likely you are to find the root cause of the problem. This approach might include a very carefully designed research plan that collects large amounts of data with extensive analysis to generate findings and recommendations. Although it might take longer than some of the other approaches, the scientific approach is especially effective in large projects which have a longer time frame. The systems approach sees the organization as an integration of subsystems, for example, of departments and management functions. It tries to find what's called the leverage point for change. That's the point where focused attention is more likely to improve the entire organization. This systems approach can be very powerful and can take less time than the scientific approach. The organic approach is based on the belief that systems such as people and organizations are so dynamic and ever-changing that there will always be problems of some sort. So the goal is to keep addressing each one as it occurs, recognizing that's just the nature of life and work. This approach might produce very quick results, but can be difficult to communicate and explain to others. The silo approach focuses almost completely on one subsystem in the organization, for example, on one department or management function. If the client experiences major problems in that one area and wants attention only to that one area, then the silo approach sometimes is the only option. It's important to know your preferred approach as well as the approach that you suggest for the project. You might explain your approaches and then ask your client to describe theirs. Discuss how your approaches might affect the activities of discovery. And it's important now to begin targeting the problem. So you might start asking your client some questions to focus your research. Otherwise, considering the sheer scope and dynamics of the typical organization, you and your client's project team probably wouldn't know where to start. Remember from the earlier module about contracting in this program that you might summarize what you heard the client say about the problem even in your first meeting with your client. Now, mention that you'd like to ask some more questions about the problem. For example, ask your client, what do you think is causing the problem? Where is that in the organization? Is it a certain team or management activity, or a major process, or is it the entire organization? How did you come to that conclusion? What do you think should be done? How might we do that? What other useful questions should we address now? And at this point, you might share your opinion about where to start focusing in the project. For example, you might summarize to the client, you've mentioned several problems with your leadership team. You think the problem starts with them, and you said you weren't sure. You seem to think that because they don't get enough done and they argue a lot. You're being careful, though, to say that you're not sure that's where the problem starts. Is that a good summary of what you've been saying? Then you might add to your client, how about if we start there for now and see where that takes us? We won't make any conclusions for now, and we're certainly not blaming anyone. I doubt that we'll ever do that at all in the project. That's not how I like to work anyway. What do you think? Ask your client if they thought your questions were good ones, and if they think we should ask those questions or other questions to some other people in the organization. Start referring to the questions as your project's research questions. Explain to your client that it's good to work from questions now because they really focus your efforts, and the questions tend to make people think and learn at the same time. Now it's useful to select what I'm going to call a performance benchmark. You and your client and the project team, if you select a performance standard or a benchmark, you can use that to measure your progress as you begin to solve the problem for your client. And the benchmark can focus on a job, a process, a team, the entire organization. And they might be referred to as best practices or standards of excellence. A performance standard is based on research and experts' opinions about best practices or standards of excellence for a function such as a team, process, or the organization. And there are many standards available. For example, let's assume the focus of the client's problem is the client's leadership team. Then we could use a performance standard for teams. The standard gives perspective on the problem and can even suggest solutions. For example, the standard might suggest that a good team always has clear purpose, roles, and leadership, and sufficient resources for members to do their jobs. So those team features could be recommendations in this project. Without some standard, many projects resort primarily to brainstorming sessions. While that can be powerful, it can be limiting, because the brainstorming still is confined only to what participants can imagine or know, not to what many experts have researched and learned in the form of best practices or standards. Let's pause now to capture the learning from what you've heard so far in this video. And in your learning journal for this program, go to the section entitled Reflections from the Readings and Videos and enter the 2 following questions. They're intended to customize the contents of the video to you and your clients. You might discuss the questions with your peers. The questions are, what approach to discovery do you prefer in your work with your clients? Scientific, systems, organic, silo? What might be the advantages and disadvantages of your preferred approach? And next, what is your preferred performance benchmark or set of best practices that you use to decide if a certain activity needs attention in your client's organization? For example, how do you decide if their board needs work or not? You can pause the video by clicking on the pause button at the bottom left corner of the video. It's the button with 2 bars in it. After you've addressed the questions in your journal, then click on the button again to resume the video. Now, we're ready to focus our research even more by further refining our research questions. We saw 5 very good questions in a previous slide. Let's consider some more questions that can be focused on the problem, then we'll give suggestions for whom to pose those questions to. The way that you further focus your research depends on your overall approach to discovery. If you prefer the organic approach, then you might not be all that concerned about refining your research. You might believe that it's okay to start anywhere, but to just keep trying. If you prefer a silo approach, then you might refine your research down to that one very specific area. Peter Block, who we often refer to in CDI, suggests that information about a problem be gathered from 2 sides, the technical side and the management side. We'll take the liberty of translating those terms slightly to mean the business side and the people side. In our example of the problematic leadership team, your research questions about the business side of the problem might be, what is the business purpose of the team? Do all team members see it that way? How do you know? What is your role on the team? Are all members clear on their role, and how do you know? And who is the leader on your team? Do all members see it that way? Does your team have sufficient expertise to do its job? Does it really know the purpose? Does it have a way of making decisions and solving problems? Does it have a budget? In our example, some possible questions about the people side might be, how do you feel about the team? What would you like more of? And what would you like less of? You might even further organize questions to be about the present and about the future. For example, what happened in the past to cause this problem? What would the situation or particular function look like when it's solved in the future? You remember that a performance standard suggests the qualities that something should have and how it should operate. That could give you ideas about what information to ask for. In our past example of the problem with the leadership team, the standard might suggest that all teams have clear means of communication and procedures to make decisions and solve problems. Ask the client's leadership team if that's true about them. Now we'll talk about collecting data to start answering those questions. So you'll soon be collecting information to answer the questions using various tools. You, your client, and the project team should decide which tools to use now. Here's a list of common tools and a brief description of each. We'll talk about how to select those tools in the next slide. Review of documentation is a good way to quickly learn about a process without interrupting it. It can include review of marketing materials, evaluations, policies, procedures, or meeting minutes. This can be very time-consuming though. Observation of people is a good way to gather accurate information about how an activity actually occurs. It can be difficult to accurately interpret what you're seeing people do because people can be inhibited just by having you around. And questionnaires are a good way to quickly get lots of information in a non-threatening way. The questions should be worded very carefully because they could be interpreted differently by different people, which could cause confusing answers. In interviews, they're a powerful way to understand someone's experiences and perspectives, and they too can be time-consuming. You have to be careful how you word your questions. Focus groups can be a good way to quickly explore a topic in depth through group feedback, but you need a trained facilitator. And case studies are a good way to clearly depict the story or ongoing experiences of someone or something. Don't forget to use your own experience. The client is paying you for that and your expertise. When deciding what tools to use to collect data, it's extremely important to consider the people who will be providing the information. Your client and project team should be involved in the selection of the tools. Consider, does the organization have the time and the resources to actually use the tools? For example, if employees are extremely busy, they're not likely to devote a lot of time to a long questionnaire or be willing to participate in a 2-hour interview. Consider the client's culture. Are there words or phrases in the tools that are not used in the culture, or worse, might have derogatory meanings? Do people in the culture see asking questions as being rude or disrespectful? If the problem is severe, you won't want to spend a lot of time collecting a lot of information. Instead, you'll want a smaller amount of information that will focus first and foremost on the problem area so that you and your client can more quickly take action. Last, consider your own expertise. Will you know how to design, develop, and use the tools? For example, if you admit to yourself that you have certain strong biases, then perhaps you should work with someone else to design and develop questionnaires. Or if you have hearing problems or physical disabilities that would impede interviews, then have someone else do them, or don't use them. Before you start to collect data, your client and project team should announce the research to the people who will be providing the information. This makes a big difference in how much open and honest feedback is collected. Your client should explain the purpose of the research and its benefits to them. For example, how it will increase profits or sales, or decrease conflicts and turnover. Employees will be more inclined to give open and honest feedback if they understand the benefits of the research to them. Your client should be very careful not to judge or blame anyone in her announcement. Employees might already be feeling some anxiety about the situation. Hearing that there will be no judgment or blame supports open and honest feedback. The client should introduce you or the researcher, including where you're from, your experiences and expertise, your values, and your goals in collecting the information. Your client and you should emphasize the confidentiality of the information that employees could share. Specify that, for example, only themes and patterns in the information will be shared with others, unless an employee specifically asks to have his or her name associated with the information. End the announcement by sharing the name of a person who can be contacted in case there's any additional questions. For example, contact information for the client or someone on the project team. By now, you and your client should have a good impression of what data you'll need to answer your research questions and a good idea of what tools to use. Next, you should think about who you'll get the information from. Be sure to get suggestions from your client and project team. First, get information from those who are closest to the problem. In our previous example of the leadership team, you'd start by getting information from its members. They'll likely have the most information and be eager to share it with you. If you do not work with them first, they'll become even more frustrated. They'll hear that you're getting information, but not from them. So start there. Next, work with other people who seem most affected by the problem. In our example, that might be people who need information from the team in order to do their jobs, but aren't getting it. It might be people whose performance is hurt because of perceived problems on the leadership team. Then work with people who seem very interested in the problem. For example, people who provide input or services to those in the problem area, but who might sense that there's a problem. In our example, it might be people who give information to the members of the leadership team so they can do their jobs. Next, get information from people who make decisions about the activities of the people in the problem area. Again, in our example, that could be the supervisors of the members of the team or people who direct the activities of the team. This is one of the few situations where collaborative consulting might not be best. Employees are more likely to be open and honest with someone who is not a member of the organization. The consultant or outside researcher might be best to collect data in this situation. While collecting information, remember what you learned about yourself in CDI's course, Understanding Yourself as Consultant. Don't let yourself overlook or discount information because of your preferred style, your biases, or because of what you see or don't see in organizations. If you encounter questionable practices during your data collection, it might help you to re-review CDI's course, Standards, Principles, and Risks in Consulting. Now that you've gathered the data by asking your research questions, it's time to organize and begin analyzing the data in order to generate findings and recommendations. Ideally, this would be done with your client and project team, but that depends on how confidential your perceived information really is. The first task in analyzing information is to make a copy of it. That might sound obvious, but if the original information is damaged or lost, that could really hurt the project. So make copies. While analyzing and organizing your data, again, remember your biases that you learned about in the course Understanding Yourself as Consultant. It's amazing how people who focus primarily on people skills only tend to see people issues, or people who focus on business issues only see those in the data as well. Begin organizing the information, and that might feel a bit challenging at first, but then it quickly starts to come together. Start by making separate piles of information. For example, before you start making spreadsheets. In that first quick pass through the information, you'll already start to notice how you might best organize it. For example, start to group similar information together, such as very high versus very low rankings or ratings. That's called quantitative information because you can quantify it. The analysis of that kind of information can involve making averages, which is quick and easy. It's a great way to combine and convey information. Next, read the commentary provided. For example, during interviews. Organize data into recurring patterns and themes in the commentary. For example, what was said more often or more strongly. That's called qualitative information. You might further organize data into various common functions, such as boards, strategic planning, marketing, staffing, finances. You also might further organize data according to topics suggested by the performance standard. In our example of the leadership team, you could organize information that you collected about the team's purpose, roles, leadership, and so on. Now that you've organized your data, it's time for you and your client to generate recommendations to present or feedback to other members of the organization. But before you do, let's look at some guidelines for generating the most useful recommendations. Focused on the most important ones for now. In fact, you might look at the top 5 to 7 issues, and you don't want to overwhelm your client with too many issues to understand and approve. And for each issue, have one overall recommendation and perhaps associate any lower level recommendations even later on in the next phase in consulting called action planning. Be sure that your recommendations will suit the culture and the mission of your client's organization. For example, don't recommend that all employees be taught coaching based exclusively on questioning if their culture is totally averse to questions in the first place. Or don't strongly recommend that the organization expand its markets around the country if the organization has branded itself as a locally owned business. Be sure your client even has the resources to do the recommendations. They should already have or be able to quickly get sufficient resources to follow the recommendations. For example, sufficient funding, expertise, and facilities. Focus recommendations on what the client should do, not on how to do it. And a good way to stick to that difference is to talk about goals rather than recommendations. Goals are described as results, not as much as methods to achieve them. Focus recommendations on both the people and the business side of the organization. If our example of the leadership team is what we look at now, you would not recommend only that people must get along better with each other or that people must feel more satisfaction in their jobs. That is, you would not only look at the people side. Instead, you might also recommend more clarity of the team's purpose, goals, and roles. Then you could add a recommendation later on to assess the satisfaction level among team members. And prioritize your recommendations. For example, urgent versus desired, or short-term versus long-term. Your project team can help you to decide how to prioritize them now. By the way, in Part 4 of your textbook, Field Guide to Consulting and Organizational Development, there's a list of common recommendations in tables 8 and 9 that might be useful to you now. Now that you've heard guidelines to generate recommendation, let's actually start generating some. And first, look at the performance standard that you selected for the area of the problem. We'll call that a function for now. And functions in an organization can be a job role, a team, process, or the entire organization. In our earlier example, the function is teams, the client's leadership team. So you could generate recommendations by looking at the performance standard for teams. Are there any industry standards to suggest a certain level of performance for that function? What recommendations would be helpful to meet each standard? For example, If you're helping your client to develop a team to implement a certain model of quality management, such as Six Sigma, then what are the standards for that team? You learned in CDI's course, Understanding Organizations, that systems have life cycles just like people. For example, stages of birth, growth, and maturity. What recommendations would help your client system or function to evolve to the next level in that cycle? You can always resort to brainstorming, but keep in mind though that brainstorming again is based only on what people in the organization can imagine. Their imaginations are limited by what they don't know and what they don't know that they don't know. Those people might also be so unrealistic in their expectations that their recommendations make things worse rather than better. So don't just use brainstorming only. Always consider the recommendations of your client and employees who provided the data. Their recommendations are highly credible because of their knowledge of the problem, and you need their buy-in when asking them to approve the recommendations. They should feel that you heard them and respected their ideas. And consider your own judgment. Again, remember your biases and the lens that you examined in CDI's course, Understanding Yourself as a Consultant. The time that you share the results of your research and recommendations with others is commonly referred to as the feedback meeting, and we'll refer to Peter Block again. As with many activities in consulting, this should be designed collaboratively with your project team. I'll take a few quiet seconds as you glance at the proposed agenda, especially the suggested topics and timings now. A common mistake is to allocate far too much time to discussion about the client's problem. Many people, including many consultants, assume that the more the participants in the meeting know about the problem, including the dynamics of its causes and effects, the more participants will be able to address those problems later on. That assumption is mostly not valid because major problems in organizations rarely have simple, rational causes that can be fully understood. Actually, deep delving into the problem might result in participants feeling deep anxiety and despair. Most members of the organization are already aware of the issues, and they want to move forward to address them as soon as possible, rather than spending a lot of time looking into the past. Instead, in this meeting, focus participants on moving forward. Focus them on deciding which recommendations to follow. If they suggest that they'll select the recommendations after this meeting, then promptly and strongly encourage them to make decisions now during this meeting. Explain that if they don't select recommendations now, then it's very possible they will leave this meeting and go right back to their old way of doing things, old ways that might have created some of their issues in the first place. So strongly encourage them to go forward now by making decisions today. We recommend about 30 minutes for them to come to a decision about recommendations. So if you've been working in a highly collaborative approach with your client, then the recommendations in this phase of consulting are as much from your client as from you. Reinforce that perspective during the feedback meeting. That will help others in the organization to more readily accept the recommendations since they are coming from the client rather than only from you. And again, it's useful to start the feedback meeting by helping participants adopt an attitude of moving forward rather than to the past, and explain to them that it's natural for people to slip into analyzing the past. Explain to them, though, that there usually isn't a rational reason for issues, or frankly, they would have found them already. Encourage them to move forward instead by selecting recommendations and focusing their energies on implementing them rather than trying to analyze the past. When presenting recommendations, focus on the top level ones. For example, one for each of the top 5 to 7 issues that you and your client selected. Don't address the lower level ones. Save those for the next phase of consulting, the action planning phase. And a good principle when facilitating this meeting is to remember to let the client select which recommendations to follow, not you. If they ask which ones to follow, respond that you and the team collected all of the possible recommendations, but the participants in the meeting should really decide. Just be sure that you don't find yourself somehow assigning which ones to follow. And keep them highly focused in this meeting. Focus them on understanding your description of the research, the issues that you and your client found, but especially on the recommendations. Don't let them stray into analyzing causes again. They could spend days or weeks on that, and probably already have. If they seem stalled or stuck in selecting recommendations to follow, then ask them what will happen if we do nothing. That question usually focuses them on consensus around solutions rather than on unanimous agreement on causes and finding the perfect solution. By the way, when facilitating this meeting, remember the knowledge that you got about facilitating from the CDI course, Primary Methods and Myths in Consulting. Let's pause again to capture the learning from what you've heard so far. And in your learning journal, address the following 2 questions. How do you share the results of your discovery with your clients? That is, how do you conduct your feedback meetings? How well does that approach work for you? And next, how successful are you at collaborating with your clients? That is, at getting them to almost partner with you in doing the discovery phase of consulting. Pause and resume the video. Thank you for viewing this video from CDI. If you ever have any questions or want to share feedback about the CDI program, simply send us email to info@consultantsdevelopmentinstitute.org. Thank you.